When you go about your day-to-day life, you've probably heard the word alcohol being used to refer to the sort of alcoholic drinks that you may have seen and heard of before, also in your day-to-day life. However, alcohol isn't the type of stuff that's actually inside of the drinks, like beer or whatever. It's actually ethanol. And ethanol is a type of alcohol, and it's probably the least poisonous inside of the sort of alcoholic drinks that you may have seen and heard before, because there are so many other different types of alcohol, because alcohol is like a whole sort of category of things. That's the word I've been looking for. And ethanol, propanol, butanol, all that sort of stuff is inside of this category. And ethanol is the sort of main one that's inside drinks, and it's the one we're going to be talking about today for the majority of the video, because the main constituent inside a lot of alcoholic drinks is just ethanol plus water, and there are a few other little side ingredients which don't really end up adding much in the end, but ethanol is the main thing. And ethanol has quite an interesting chemical structure, and personally I find science, chemistry, all that sort of stuff really, really interesting. It's quite weird, but it's just interesting to me. And it has the chemical formula of C2H5OH, and it's quite a small molecule, and that is the cause of one of many issues when it's inside of the body. But what's interesting about ethanol is that it's not far from being a literal oil, as the single hydroxyl group that is on ethanol and the single oxygen atom that is bonded to the carbon and the hydrogen either side of it, is that if that oxygen didn't exist and it was just a hydrogen, it would literally be oil and natural gas that you literally use to sort of burn things and light barbecues, the sort of little gas canisters that you see. All of that stuff is literally just ethanol without the oxygen atom. And while ethanol is also quite a flammable thing and does have similar properties to oil in some way or another, it's quite interesting because you would probably immediately die if you drank something that wasn't ethanol and was sort of the oil form just without the oxygen atom, if that makes any sense. But when people do drink alcohol, it ends up being metabolized by the liver, and that's kind of the process that I want to go through in this video today. So when alcohol gets absorbed into your bloodstream by your gut, it will then diffuse into the liver cells once it's passed through your heart, your arteries, and it does a whole load of bad things, by the way. It will then go into the liver, and this is where the first step of its metabolism occurs, and it's the reaction of ethanol turning into acetaldehyde. And this reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase. And this reaction also needs an NAD plus molecule on the sort of left side of the reaction, and it ends up producing an NADH molecule when the sort of reaction is finished. And there are a few interesting things about acetaldehyde, because while it is called acetaldehyde, ethanol and acetaldehyde are sort of the language that's used to name these two substances is quite interesting, because acet and eth, those two prefixes, mean the same thing. They mean two. Anything that's like acetate, acetone, acetyl, all of those sort of molecules, they all have two carbons. Acet and eth refer to two, but acet seems to be sort of the American way of doing it, and that is sort of what ends up ruling the kind of world in a way. But eth is what I've grown up with and I've used to when referring to ethanol. But if you want to sort of acetaldehyde using the sort of eth prefix, it's actually called ethanal, just spelt slightly differently. Instead of anol, it's just anal, A-N-A-L. It's a slight spelling difference. But what's interesting about ethanal / acetaldehyde is that it's one oxygen away, again, from being a very, very, very useful molecule. Acetyl is something that can be bonded to coenzyme A to make a whole load of different chemicals inside of the body, and it's an incredibly fundamental thing and basic human thing that's needed for survival, which is quite interesting how acetaldehyde and ethanal is a literal group 1 carcinogen, meaning that it is known and proved and tested to cause cancer inside of the body. It's one atom away from being something that's fundamentally needed for human existence. I personally find that very, very interesting. The fine lines of science and chemistry fascinates me, and I know I seem quite weird for that if that's not really your sort of cup of tea, something that really interests you in a way. But personally for me, that just absolutely sets my brain on fire and makes the world that I see and observe around me so much more interesting. And acetaldehyde, it's often the thing that causes like the hangovers or whatever that are sort of experienced after like a night out of drinking, that's because it does do things to your brain, passes through the blood-brain barrier. So does ethanol, and that's the thing that makes you drunk. But acetaldehyde is the thing that gives you the hangover, as well as the fact that ethanol dehydrates your brain. But I'm going to go over that in another video of the general effects that alcohol actually has on the body. And that'll be sort of like a really quick video where I just quickly speed run all the effects. That there were quite a few of them, and I've only got 20 so far, but there probably is a lot more that I could possibly think of, just in general. Now, I've gone on a little bit of a side tangent, but to go back to the sort of actual metabolism of ethanol, it ends up going from ethanal/acetaldehyde, catalyzed by the enzyme aldehyde dehydrogenase, and this reaction also needs an NAD plus molecule on the sort of left side of the reaction, and it ends up producing an NADH molecule when the sort of reaction is finished, and this ends up going and turning into acetate. Now, acetate isn't actually a stable molecule, it's an ionized molecule. So this next reaction that I'm going to talk about in a few seconds probably happens almost immediately, and so do all these kind of chemical reactions happen, by the way. It probably goes from ethanol to acetaldehyde. The second it enters the liver and the enzyme acts on it, then while some may escape and circulate once or twice around the body, it's probably almost immediately, in the majority of cases, remetabolized into acetate. And then because acetate is an ion rather than, it's not actually an ion, but it's a charged molecule, if that makes any sense. And this will probably be immediately turned into acetyl. And acetyl, again, like acetate, is a charged molecule, but then acetyl is probably immediately joined to coenzyme A, and that is essentially the end of the metabolism. From ethanol to acetyl coenzyme A, that is pretty much the entire metabolism of ethanol, and then acetyl-CoA will enter the Krebs cycle, the tricarboxylic acid cycle, the citric acid cycle, whatever you want to call it, and this ends up producing energy for the body. So acetyl-CoA, an incredibly important molecule, which you can get from other ways. You don't have to get it from ethanol. Please don't take this the wrong way, to think that, oh, ethanol ends up having a good impact on your body in the end, because acetyl-CoA ends up being in the body from the breakdown of fatty acids, which, that shows that fats can be important and necessary inside of the body if that contradicted your current belief. But as I said before, there isn't just ethanol inside of alcoholic drinks. There's a few more, many of which are too complicated for me to talk about because a lot of them are just incredibly poisonous, and as soon as you ingest them in too large quantities, they are essentially just like completely gone out of the body. But the majority of these very small levels of poisonous toxins, they're just immediately excreted by the kidneys because the body is focusing too much on metabolizing the ethanol, and so this stuff isn't metabolized into even worse carcinogens, etc., and it's just sort of ridded from the body before it can go through any sort of reaction metabolism steps and stuff like that. But I could find a single reaction step, which was propanol ends up turning into propionic acid from the same thing, alcohol dehydrogenase, and I assume that's then either put into another system or that then gets excreted out of the body just like normal. But that's basically it. That is every single alcohol type that I could find that ends up getting metabolized by the liver and then excreted out of the body. And I hope you found value out this video, and I also recommend subscribing because I love this community of young troubled people who are willing to improve themselves so much more than they already have, and good luck.